For nearly 2 decades, people have talked about one film as if it were the complete story. A story of suffering, blood, silence, a cross on a hill outside Jerusalem. But according to recent interviews, reports, and statements surrounding Mel Gibson's upcoming project, that story may have only been the beginning. Now, a new chapter is taking shape in southern Italy. Cameras are rolling again. Ancient streets are being rebuilt. And this time, the focus is no longer only the crucifixion. It is what came after. Not everyone agrees on how these events should be portrayed. Some believers see this project as a spiritual continuation of the Passion of the Christ. Others remain cautious, wondering whether cinema can truly approach subjects this sacred without drifting into speculation. But one thing is clear. The conversation around the resurrection of the Christ has already become much larger than a normal movie release. And at the center of it all lies one haunting question. What happened between the cross and the resurrection? For centuries, Christian tradition has focused intensely on Good Friday and Easter Sunday, the death of Jesus, the empty tomb. But the silence in between has often remained mysterious, interpreted differently across theological traditions and historical readings. According to multiple public comments from Mel Gibson and people connected to the production, the upcoming film intends to explore that hidden interval in unprecedented detail, not simply as historical drama, but as a spiritual and psychological journey. Reports indicate the project will be released in 2 separate films. The first is expected to arrive on Good Friday in 2027. The second, according to statements connected to the production, may follow 40 days later, aligned symbolically with Ascension Day. If that plan remains unchanged, it would create a very unusual cinematic structure. Instead of giving audiences immediate closure, the story itself would pause in the middle of uncertainty. Viewers would wait through the same symbolic 40-day period described in the New Testament accounts between the resurrection and the ascension of Jesus. Some commentators believe Gibson is attempting something more experiential than narrative, not merely telling the story, but asking audiences to sit inside the tension of it. Because according to the Gospel accounts, the resurrection did not instantly erase fear or confusion. Even after reports of the empty tomb began spreading, doubt remained. The disciples hid behind locked doors. Rumors circulated. Some believed, others hesitated. That emotional uncertainty may become one of the central themes of the film itself. And perhaps that is why this project has generated so much fascination. Not because it retells familiar scenes, but because it attempts to dramatize what many believers consider the most mysterious phase of the Christian story. And maybe that's why so many people remain divided about what truly happened during those silent days between the cross and the resurrection. If this story still fascinates you decades later, let me know in the comments what part of the resurrection narrative you believe has been least understood over the years. The production itself has reportedly faced years of delays. Gibson has spoken openly in past interviews about the complexity of the screenplay and the difficulty of visualizing spiritual realities on screen. According to various entertainment reports, the script was developed over many years alongside Gibson's brother Donald Gibson and screenwriter Randall Wallace, known for Braveheart. Some reports describe the screenplay as unusually ambitious, blending biblical narrative, symbolic imagery, and theological interpretation. That ambition may also explain why the project changed direction several times. For years, many viewers assumed Jim Caviezel would return as Jesus after his iconic role in the Passion of the Christ. Caviezel himself referenced the possibility publicly on several occasions, yet later reports suggested Gibson ultimately chose a different cast for major roles. According to comments attributed to Gibson, part of the reasoning was artistic. Some interpretations suggest he wanted a new generation of audiences to encounter the figure of Christ through fresh performances rather than nostalgia. The reported cast now includes Finnish actor Jaakko Outen as Jesus, alongside actors portraying Mary Magdalene, Peter, Pontius Pilate, and the Virgin Mary. But the casting debate may only be the surface of a much deeper challenge surrounding the project. Because beyond the casting choices lies a far more difficult question: how do you portray resurrection itself? How do you portray resurrection? How do you visualize the unseen? And how do you dramatize ideas that believers themselves interpret differently? According to Christian scripture, Jesus died on Friday afternoon outside Jerusalem during Passover. The gospel narratives describe darkness over the land, earthquakes, and the tearing of the temple veil. Afterward, Joseph of Arimathea, identified as a respected member of the Jewish council and a follower of Jesus, requested permission from Pontius Pilate to bury the body. Together with Nicodemus, he placed Jesus in a rock-hewn tomb before the Sabbath began. Those details are widely rooted in the gospel accounts themselves. But after that point, interpretations begin to diverge. One of the themes reportedly explored in Gibson's film is the descent into Hades, or descent into hell, a concept referenced in some Christian traditions and theological writings. Interpretations vary significantly across denominations. Some see it symbolically, others see it literally. Still others treat it cautiously due to limited biblical detail. Because of that, many descriptions surrounding the film use interpretive language rather than definitive claims. According to some theological interpretations, Christ's descent represented victory over death itself. Some traditions connect this idea to passages in 1 Peter, Ephesians, and Revelation. Others interpret those passages differently or more metaphorically. That distinction matters. And based on available interviews, the filmmakers appear aware of how sensitive this territory is. Gibson has reportedly described the film less as a standard biblical epic and more as a mystical journey. Some reports suggest the production team has consulted historians, theologians, and artists to help shape visual representations of spiritual concepts without presenting interpretation as undeniable historical certainty. Even so, the project remains controversial. For some viewers, visualizing spiritual warfare risks becoming sensationalized. Others believe art has always attempted to depict invisible realities through symbolism and metaphor, and perhaps that tension is unavoidable. Because resurrection itself sits beyond ordinary categories. The gospel accounts describe something physical, yet transformed, familiar, yet difficult to recognize. Mary Magdalene reportedly mistakes Jesus for a gardener before recognizing him. The disciples on the road to Emmaus walk beside him without realizing who he is. Thomas doubts until invited to touch the wounds. These moments matter because they are filled with uncertainty rather than immediate triumph. And that uncertainty may become one of the film's strongest emotional tools. Instead of presenting the resurrection as a clean ending, the story becomes a transition between fear and conviction. According to the New Testament, the empty tomb did not instantly create faith. It created questions. Very early on Sunday morning, several women approached the tomb expecting to mourn. Instead, according to the gospel narratives, they found the stone rolled away and the body missing. Mary Magdalene becomes one of the central witnesses in these accounts. In a historical context, that detail is especially significant because women in first-century Judea generally held limited legal credibility as witnesses in formal settings. Some historians and Christian apologists have argued that this detail strengthens the authenticity of the narrative because it would have been culturally inconvenient to invent. Others approach that argument more cautiously. But regardless of interpretation, the women remain central to the resurrection narratives themselves. According to the Gospels, Mary Magdalene encountered the risen Jesus before many of the male disciples did. And yet, even after those reports spread, disbelief continued. Peter and John ran to inspect the tomb personally. The disciples remained hidden behind fear. Some believed the reports immediately. Others did not. This gradual movement from confusion toward conviction forms the backbone of the 40-day period after the resurrection. And that period appears to be the emotional centerpiece of Gibson's planned structure. According to Christian scripture, Jesus appeared repeatedly after the resurrection, to individuals, to small groups, according to one passage in 1 Corinthians, even to more than 500 people at once. Interpretations of those appearances vary widely among believers, skeptics, historians, and theologians. For believers, they represent proof of resurrection. For skeptics, they may represent visionary experiences, legend development, or collective testimony shaped by faith. The film reportedly intends to remain anchored primarily in the biblical narrative itself, while using cinematic interpretation to fill emotional and visual gaps. And for filmmakers trying to bring those accounts to the screen, that creates enormous visual and emotional challenges. Because the risen Jesus, according to Scripture, is not portrayed as a ghost. He eats with the disciples, speaks with them, shows physical wounds, yet also appears suddenly in locked rooms and vanishes from sight. Christian theology later described this concept as the glorified body. Cinema has rarely attempted to portray that idea seriously without drifting into fantasy conventions. That may be why Gibson reportedly delayed production multiple times. Some reports suggest he became intensely focused on realism, returning to locations used during the Passion of the Christ and rebuilding ancient environments with even greater historical detail. But realism in this project may extend far beyond visuals alone. One of the defining choices of the Passion of the Christ was Gibson's use of Aramaic, Latin, and Hebrew instead of English. At the time, many believed audiences would reject a subtitled biblical film. Instead, it became one of the most financially successful non-English films ever made. For the new project, reports suggest the approach may differ slightly. Some scenes may continue using ancient languages for authenticity, while others may include more English dialogue to widen accessibility and emphasize the universal scope of the resurrection message. Again, interpretations vary on whether this strengthens or weakens immersion, but it reflects an important thematic shift. The first film centered heavily on suffering and intimacy. The new project appears aimed more toward proclamation, transformation, and mission, and perhaps nowhere is that clearer than in the planned ending. According to the New Testament, the story concludes not at the tomb, but at the Mount of Olives. After 40 days of appearances and teaching, Jesus ascends before his followers. The ascension has often received far less cinematic attention than the crucifixion itself. Yet, within Christian theology, it represents the transition from earthly ministry to global mission. Before ascending, Jesus commissions his followers to carry the message outward. And historically speaking, something extraordinary happened afterward. Within a relatively short period, the Christian movement expanded across the Roman Empire, despite persecution, political opposition, and internal division. Historians debate many aspects of that growth. But the growth itself is not disputed. And for many believers, the resurrection stands at the center of why it happened. Yet the fascination surrounding this project is not limited to theology or filmmaking alone. Stories from the filming of the Passion of the Christ itself. Some cast and crew members later described unusual experiences during production. One widely repeated account involved actor Jim Caviezel reportedly being struck by lightning during filming. Entertainment outlets covered the incident at the time, though details sometimes vary between retellings. Other stories involve injuries, emotional strain, difficult weather conditions, and personal spiritual experiences among the crew. It is important to distinguish these accounts carefully. Some are documented production incidents. Others are testimonies or personal interpretations shared afterward by individuals involved. Some viewers interpret these stories spiritually. Others see them as coincidences amplified by the emotionally intense subject matter. Either way, those stories helped build an atmosphere of mystery around the original film, and that atmosphere now follows the sequel, especially because this new project moves beyond suffering into resurrection, ascension, and the unseen world. And perhaps that is why reactions remain so divided. Some people see the upcoming films as a bold artistic meditation on faith, Others worry they may blur the line between scripture and cinematic invention. Both concerns are understandable, because every attempt to visualize sacred mystery carries risk. Still, anticipation continues to grow, not only among religious audiences, but also among film historians and cultural observers curious about whether Gibson can once again create a global event from deeply theological material. And perhaps that is the real question surrounding this entire project. Not whether audiences already know the story, but whether they are prepared to experience it differently. Because according to many interpretations, the resurrection was never meant to function simply as an ending. It was meant to become a beginning, a turning point, a moment when frightened followers became witnesses, when grief became mission, when silence became proclamation. Whether the upcoming films succeed artistically or not, they are clearly attempting something unusual in modern cinema, slowing audiences down inside uncertainty instead of rushing them toward resolution. And in an era built on instant reactions and disappearing attention spans, that alone may be one of the project's boldest ideas. And despite all the discussion surrounding the project, many of its biggest details remain unknown. Trailers are limited. Official details remain guarded. Rumors continue circulating online, especially regarding possible visionary sequences inspired by Revelation imagery and apocalyptic symbolism. But at this stage, many of those reports remain speculative. There has been no confirmed announcement of a separate Book of Revelation adaptation. Some interpretations may simply arise from comments about visualizing transcendence and glory within the resurrection narrative itself. And that distinction matters, because speculation can easily become misinformation when repeated carelessly. For now, what exists are interviews, production reports, theological traditions, and enormous public curiosity. The rest remains unseen. Maybe that uncertainty is fitting. After all, according to the gospel narratives themselves, the first witnesses to the resurrection also struggled to understand what they were seeing. Some doubted. Some believed immediately. Some ran toward the tomb. Others stayed hidden behind locked doors. And perhaps that is why this story continues resurfacing generation after generation. Not because every question has been answered, but because the questions themselves refuse to disappear. So now the cameras roll once again through ancient stone streets in Italy. Actors step into roles that carry centuries of meaning, and somewhere between history, belief, testimony, interpretation, and cinema, another attempt is being made to tell one of humanity's most enduring stories. Not only the story of suffering, but the story of what people believed happened after the silence. And perhaps that is why this story continues to return generation after generation, not simply as history, but as a question people still wrestle with today. If you want to follow more deep cinematic explorations like this one, covering biblical history, faith, mystery, and the stories behind films like The Resurrection of the Christ, subscribe and stay with us for the next chapter.